Hello and welcome to Africa 360. I'm Kwanguli Wewe. Zambia's interim leader made history recently by becoming the first white African president in sub-Saharan Africa since the apartheid years. Guy Scott was appointed Zambia's president for 3 months following the death of President Michael Sata. While Zambia still mourns Sata's death, there are also concerns that his passing has created a political power vacuum. Before we go into our discussion about this, let's take a look at who Michael Sata was.
Don't talk to the police, leave them.
An abrasive figure popularly known in Zambia as King Cobra. Michael Sata was elected Zambia's 5th president 3 years ago in one of the southern African country's closest contested election. He was a social democrat and a former trade unionist who spent many years of his life in Zambia's opposition politics. Born 6 July 1937, Sata once served as one of former President Frederick Chiluba's ministers during the 90s. However, in 2001, Michael Sata broke ranks with the ruling movement for multi-party democracy at the time, forming his own political party, the Patriotic Front. It was through his newly formed party that he decided to challenge for the presidency. After 3 unsuccessful runs for Zambia's top job, Sata finally emerged victorious in the 2011 elections, defeating incumbent President Rupia Banda. It was that historic victory that made him the first opposition leader elected president in Africa in many years. Although he was considered a breath of fresh air in Zambian politics when he took over the reins, Sata's term in office has not been without controversies. His attacks on foreign companies rattled international investors.
Why should there be special conditions for the Chinese and Malaysians?
Foreign mining firms, often from China, have frequently been the target of his criticism, particularly about labor conditions. His detractors, political enemies, and media alike were also not spared his verbal attacks, and this led some to suggest Sata was becoming power-hungry.
There was actually a contradiction, around that, because not only did he connect with the youth, but he also connected with the workers. Many of them who had been fired from Chinese enterprises. And he would suggest to them that were he to get power, he would address their situation. However, the reality was the reverse when he got into power. Because I think we recall the first delegation which he then sent off was to Beijing to repair relations and to tone down on his rhetoric about throwing out the Chinese or even doing something serious around the workers.
Despite his defiant political stance, though, his ailing health defined his legacy. In June this year, he disappeared from the public scene due to deteriorating health. Although he resurfaced after that, it was clear his political career hung in the balance. After his health declined, his condition was kept a secret for more than 5 months. Sata died in a London hospital, aged 77. His deputy, Guy Scott, is now acting president until elections are held in just over 2 months' time. However, there are concerns that President Sata's passing might trigger political instability in largely peaceful Zambia. Also of concern is that a power battle within the ruling Patriotic Front could derail the smooth transition of power. And the cracks are already starting to show. Squabbles for positions within the ruling party have fueled speculation that Scott may seek to run for the presidency regardless of the constitutional restrictions.
So in 90 days, what we have now seen, unprecedented violence on the streets, in Zambia, and perhaps Dr. Guy Scott miscalculating on whether or not he could fire and reinstate during the same day, the Minister of Defense, Lungu, just demonstrates the deep divisions and the lack of consensus, that we're faced with. So many of us analysts are now looking at the next 90 days as really a period of perhaps even conflict and deeper divisions within Zambia before the succession that was clearly on the cards can take place.
Michael Sata might have left a mixed legacy, but he will be remembered for being Zambia's fiery politician and a man who did not hold back with his biting remarks that aptly earned him the title King Cobra.
I'm now joined from Lusaka, Zambia by Elias Shapiro, constitutional law expert. He'll help us understand some of Zambia's constitutional dynamics with regards to the country's presidential succession procedure, and also what we can expect before elections are held in just over 2 months' time. Mr. Shapiro, thank you very much for joining us here on Africa 360. Now, let's talk about the presidential clause, Article 34 of the Constitution. It seems to be causing a storm in Zambia. This obviously disqualifies the current president, Guy Scott, from contesting for the presidency. Now, in your opinion, can he still be interim president now and act as president?
I believe that he cannot act as president for the very reason that you cannot have somebody act in a position that he doesn't qualify for. And the Constitution is very, very clear that he doesn't qualify to be president of the country. And I think that when you look at an analogy, for example, of a brain surgeon, to be able to operate on somebody, you've got to be a qualified brain surgeon. And then you can't say, well, let's say a brain surgeon isn't there. You let somebody who is not a qualified surgeon, just because there may be a medical officer, to perform the brain surgery. That would clearly be wrong.
General Mianda and others have called this a coup. How do you respond to this?
I think that it's an extra-constitutional way of getting power that Honorable Guy Scott has found himself in the seat. Because they argue that when there is a vacancy, the vice president is the one who should take up the position. But the same constitution clearly states that if there is some impediment to the vice president being able to take up that seat, then cabinet must meet and choose one from amongst their number. So at best, what should have happened, although I still contend that Article 39 meant that Honorable Lungu carries on acting. But let's say that interpretation was wrong. And then cabinet should have met and chosen somebody who is eligible from amongst their number. And that person certainly would not be Honorable Guy Scott.
Wouldn't you find it ironic that President Sata never allowed Scott to act, but now that the tables have turned, he is now the interim president?
I think that it's not ironic. I think it is sad, very sad, that what clearly was the right interpretation by the president by not allowing Honorable Guy Scott to act has been thrown away. Apart from that, the clear wishes of the president, as exhibited by 3 years of practice, was that Honorable Guy Scott was never to act as president. Now, when the president is no longer there, Honorable Guy Scott takes advantage of that situation and takes up that position against the wishes of the person who was elected by the people of Zambia. And so the person who was elected, was the one entrusted with stating who would be acting when he's not there. But when he's no longer there, they take advantage and they place somebody.
Mr. Shapiro, thank you very much for talking to us. Well, that was Elias Shapiro, a constitutional law expert. Now, do join us after the break. When we come back, we'll get reaction from one of Zambia's opposition parties. Stay with us.
The ruling party, the Patriotic Front, has been divided for a very long time, even during the time that Mr. Sata was here.
Welcome back. You're watching Africa 360, and today we're focusing on Zambia's current political situation following the recent death of President Michael Sata. Joining me now, also from Lusaka, Zambia, is Elias Shapiro, who is the president of the National Restoration Party, one of Zambia's opposition parties. Mr. Shapiro, thanks very much for joining us. Now, it's obviously a difficult time in Zambia as the country is mourning the passing of the president. What would you say President Sata's legacy was?
Well, Kwangu, it's lovely to have an opportunity to speak to you and to your viewers. And I think when we look at Mr. Sata's legacy, it will really be summed up in, I think, 3 words that characterized the man, his nature, and what he stood for and was able to achieve in his lifetime. And that is man of action. Almost at every stage of his career, he demonstrated a willingness to roll up his sleeves and get things done. Even if his methods were sometimes unorthodox, he was able to work through difficult situations, challenging situations, and deliver a result that was in keeping with his idea of what he saw as development for his country.
But some are questioning the fact that Edgar Lungu was acting president. Can an acting president hand over to another acting president? Just explain that to us.
Yeah, it's an argument which really is not borne out by anything within the Constitution. And there are 2 reasons for that. The first is that even the idea of leaving anybody other than the Republican vice president in charge of the country when the president was out of the country is itself an issue of whether the Constitution authorized it. I think, a strict interpretation of the Constitution, it should probably never have been the case that anybody other than the vice president, unless he was incapacitated or out of the country, should have been left in charge of the country. So that's the first part. The second part, in some way, is related or tied to that. And that's really the separation of these 2 provisions. When somebody dies while in office, every other provision of the Constitution falls away, and the only one that's relevant is the automatic process which is triggered once that incumbent president dies. And so the only article in the Constitution we should be looking at is the one that deals with the process following the death of the president. No other provision will override that process.
Now, just explain to us, I know you did touch a bit on it just now, but in terms of somebody who is an interim president in Zambia, just tell us what his powers will be. Because some people are actually worried now that the draft constitution has been made public, that maybe the PF-led government will try and speed things up in order for this constitution to be enacted before the elections in 90 days' time.
The Constitution really limits the role of this person who's performing an interim function to really simply acting as a caretaker figurehead, if you like, for the sake of transitioning the country between the death of the president, the time that the president dies, and the time that we have an election. It's a 3-month period. They're not expected to do anything drastic other than supervise the process by which we move quickly to electing a substantive president.
Now, a lot of the international media has been focusing on the race issue when it comes to talking about Guy Scott. How relevant is this to you Zambians who are there on the ground?
Well, it's both amusing and a little bit annoying, but I think that it's very reflective of what makes an interesting story. It's a little bit like, you know, a dog biting a man. That's really not going to make much news internationally. However, if a man in Zambia decides to bite a dog, or a man in Thailand bites a dog, I think that might attract the kind of attention that you would get from around the world, because it then becomes more of a human story because of its uniqueness. Now, if you look at Africa as a whole, certainly I think we're only comparable to South Africa, and there were reasons why there was a white head of state because of apartheid, of course. But in a non-apartheid state, in a non-apartheid era, I think it is unusual to have a white leader of a country which essentially has a predominantly black indigenous population.
Now, a lot of people, especially in the social media, had been commenting when they learnt of the death of President Sata that he had hardly been dead for a couple of hours when there'd been reports of a power struggle within the ruling party, the PF party. Now, I know you are in the opposition, but to you, is this an indication of a divisive party?
The ruling party, the Patriotic Front, has been divided for a very long time. Even during the time that Mr. Sata was here, there were actually physical running battles between the different factions within the Patriotic Front. And it was largely because there was no clear direction as to what the succession process was going to yield, or even that there was a defined succession process. But we very much expect that this will be resolved at some point, and I'm sure it will be resolved in a manner that will not lead to the kind of bloodshed and infighting, physical infighting that we saw in earlier times.
And finally, Mr. Chipimo, the daggers have been drawn. Are you contesting in the by-election?
Well, that's a very interesting question, Kwangu. We will be taking part in the presidential by-elections. In what shape or form, we will announce as soon as we have concluded our emergency National Executive Committee meeting. But I can say that we will be present. In what form that will be, we will announce in due course.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chipimo. That was Elias Shapiro of the Zambian Opposition National Restoration Party. Do join us after the break, because when we come back, I'll be joined by a panel of experts for an in-depth discussion on this. To stay with us.
We don't want a situation where so many people are fighting and they've got various camps. This is what invariably leads to bloodshed.
We are saddened by the break of the news that the president have died. We are so sad. There must be something wrong in Zambia. So what we're supposed to do is to commit this country to God and to find out why is it happening only to us, to Zambians.
I just can't believe it. It's a very shocking news. Like, seriously, this is a great loss. I really feel bad.
Welcome back to Africa 360. This week, we're looking at the recent passing of Zambian President Michael Sata and what this means for the Zambian people. I'm now joined here in our Johannesburg studios by Vixen Ngube and Joe Kawembe. Both are Zambian professionals based here in South Africa. Gentlemen, thanks very much for joining us here. Now, there's suggestions following Michael Sata's death that the country has now been plunged into a constitutional crisis. They're saying that the death has left a political power vacuum. Vixen, what do you think about this?
Yeah, well, Congo, let's look at the law of Zambia as it is. The interpreter of any constitutional provision in a country is the Supreme Court. Twice, this parentage clause that is being contended right now has gone to court. KK was challenged as to why he has been president when he's whose parentage is not Zambian. Came Frederick Chiluba too, Akashambato and group, 7 with others. They went to challenge that. And in both occasions, the Supreme Court has quoted the Independence Act to say a person who was a Zambian, or who should have been a Zambian, on the 24th of October, 1964, automatically inherited a Zambian citizenship without reference to his parentage. And I think the interpretation of the courts must be respected in the country.
Let's move on from that issue now. It appears that the Patriotic Front is a deeply divided party. Even when the late president, was quite ill, there were behind-the-scenes power struggles. We've heard about two factions. Can we talk about this? Who exactly are these two factions?
Now, Kwangu, let's put it in perspective. Every political party must have internal democracy. And this entails that the people must position themselves for power, even if he was alive and he's coming to the end of, let's say he'd gone to his second term, there will be people positioning themselves to take over. Now, we must not read too much in these things that are called divisions. In my view, it's what we call internal democracy in a political party.
Yeah, but I'm a bit worried, actually. I'm praying that these 90 days will act as a cooling off period. You will recall that the former Secretary General, Winter Kabimba, was asked to step aside. But today, I am told that he is planning a comeback. That, for me, is a bit worrying. However, it is worrying because Mr. Kabimba is a person who was so powerful, and I believe that the groupings that he had formed are still very alive. And I pray that he will not use them, to undemocratically come back into power. I would wish that he would go as an ordinary member and be placed back and not use what is existing. That is my biggest worry.
Now, Vixen, maybe you can come in here. I did ask the question, Who are these people? Name them. For the benefit of the African viewers, they're just hearing their factions in Zambia. Who are they and who are the favorites? Who are the powerful ones? Let's put their names on the table.
From what we read in the paper, they say there is the Edgar Lungu group, there is the Kambwili group. But these are things that we are reading in the media. We've never been, any one of us, in a meeting of the neck of PF. So I still come back to the point that in any organization where there's internal democracy, you do expect to have jostling for power. But
to this extent, I mean, we've seen, this is the 5th government we've seen in Zambia. Honestly speaking, I've never seen such divisiveness in the history of Zambia.
Well, maybe you were not looking at them, because at the time when there was a 3rd term debate under Frederick Chiluba, these issues were there. In fact, one of the, may he so rest in peace, one of the principal architects of properly positioning himself for power was the late president. That man was a political genius, and we must admit that. But it is an expectation that when a leader falls, people would have been positioning themselves subtly. But in this case, it has to come to the fore. So none of these people should be looked at as a faction of anyone. To me, these are people who are positioning themselves to take over the Patriotic Front. We're not even talking about Zambia, because if we came to Zambia, it's a bigger picture. But this time, within the internal democracy of the PF, they are trying to identify a leader. And each one of them must use whatever arsenal he has to get into a position, because the constitution of the country supersedes any constitution of a political party. So I believe that within the constitution of Zambia, anyone in PF has the right to vie for the presidency.
I can see you've got a point to
make. And I do agree. Everybody has got the right. But you see, I'm very worried. You see, Zambia has always been a very peaceful country. And, you know, leadership should always have citizenry in mind, first and foremost. But you see, it gets me worried when there are so many power bases, you know, at play. We've got the Kambwili group now, we've got the Edgar Lungu group, and then, of course, we've got the members, and we need to know what's happening. You know, I would love it if the PF would get together, sit down, iron out everything, and come out with only one common ground. We don't want a situation where so many people are fighting and they've got various camps. This is what invariably leads to bloodshed. So I would be very happy if this were nipped in the bud. Let there not be faction at all.
Vixen, come in there and tell us, is the PF disciplined enough to bury their differences and come out as a united front?
I should think that there are serious indications that showed us that the PF is disciplined. By the way, I'm not a member of the PF. Let me make that clear. I'm talking as a purely an outsider, and my friend, we should not mix between the government and the party. You said the PF government. As government, it's a different issue. But look at what happened. Edgar Lungu had the instruments of power left by the late president. Cabinet sits, and they say the constitution says the vice president. We never heard that way wrangles on that election.
But as you said, we don't sit in cabinet meetings, we don't sit in NEC, so we don't know what happened during those meetings.
All we know is that the outcome is Edgar Lungu didn't call a press conference to say, I'm not happy with Guy Scott. He just said, he just went quietly, and Guy Scott became the face of the PF government. And to me, it's a part with internal maturity to handle these things. Yes, there will always be conflicts. Remember, at the change of leadership, there's loss of influence. Even if we are from the same party, the people who are close to the late president and the people who are close to Winter Kabimba, the people who are close to Edgar, any one of them, once one ascends to power, someone will lose influence. And sometimes you look at the wrong people, you think this one is fighting this one. It's their supporters who are causing the noises. But I have a reason to believe that even to think of bloodshed in Zambia is so far-fetched. Look, I have lived in Zambia. I doubt if anyone can ever start shedding blood over the presidents of the country.
Now, of course, we saw the international media was awash with headlines when Guy Scott was announced as the interim president. They were talking about race. Why did race matter so much to them and not the Zambian people?
Guy Scott may be white, but he is a Zambian. He's lived amongst the Zambians, you know, and he's just been one of us. So to us, it's nothing really. I know people will look at it that way, but that's because they don't understand what happens in Zambia. Guy Scott is a Zambian, and to us, he may be white, but he's a Zambian. except that the constitution doesn't allow him to take over.
And bearing in mind, of course, the 90 days probably elapsed sometime in January. January is 2015. Elections, the general elections are 2016. Who do you think is most likely to give PF a run for their money?
In my view, it's the UPND that actually would give them a run for their money, which is why, like I was saying earlier, if they're not united, I'm afraid the PF may have to say goodbye. You see, as long as there are many camps, I'm afraid the other locomotive that's behind them will just catch up with them. That's the UPND.
Gentlemen, thank you very much for appearing on Africa 360. Well, that brings us to the end of yet another edition of Africa 360. A big thank you to my guests for joining us. Please share your views on our discussion today. You can join the debate by going to our Facebook page or tweet us your views at Africa360_ENCA. You can also send us an email to africa360@enca.com. So until next time, it's goodbye for now. Thanks for watching. Here at Africa 360, we would like to express our deepest condolences to the people of Zambia on the passing of their president, Michael Sata. May his soul rest in peace.